Hey guys, this is an impromptu video that I'm doing. It's kind of the end of the year of 2019. I'm wrapping up a few things, working on some bigger projects. So trying to put more content out, but I'm really focusing maybe on building that up as more of a scalable thing in 2020 to come next year. So with that, I recently published like a year in review on my blog. Maybe go check that out. It's only in written form. I didn't feel like doing the video for that because I think there was more to say there than a video would actually grant me. But this video is about some of my favorite Ruby gems, and you've probably seen me use a lot of these before. Maybe some you haven't. I use these, I would say, on most of my projects, the ones that make sense to use. Some are obviously ad hoc that you just need for a given thing, like Chartkick, for example, which we'll talk about. But I just wanted to go over these. I think it's always curious or interesting to see what other people who are in the framework of Ruby on Rails or Ruby reach for, and this is no exception. So I think my idea of using gems, I like the concept of using them sparingly. If I can create the logic myself and or extend it in such a way that it's just something that I can add to the app, I'm going to try to go that route. But if it ends up being a big time saver or something that just doesn't make sense to try to make myself, then I'm definitely going to reach for a gem. There's pros and cons with that. As with anything, gems go out of date, especially Ruby gems. A lot of people don't maintain them that create them, and that's basically due just because there's so much work to maintaining one. So if you can have the know-how, definitely contribute where possible. Keeps the community alive, keeps Rails and everything as strong as it is as a framework, and Ruby, of course. So digging in, you've probably heard of this one before. I'll get right to it. Is Devise. I'm really not going to run through each of these gems per se, like installing them, using them. I'm just going to talk about them. If you need to see something like that as a walkthrough, maybe mention it in the comments or let me know. I think they're most are straightforward. If you see the documentation, definitely experiment where you can. That's how I ended up learning how to use each of these. So it just takes some time and some research. And unfortunately, that's one of those things you have to do to learn. So with Devise, I have it open in this window. We've used it here on the channel before. It's basically an authentication library that's very extendable and easy to integrate. It comes with tons of stuff under the hood that you could use in terms of like a confirmation workflow, like confirming a user account, this recoverable password stuff, registering, handling, tracking users. I don't know that you'd want to do that, but it's possible. And then you can add this like OmniAuth stuff, which I've done in a previous video where we integrated like Twitter into our app. We can sign in with a social media provider or any provider that uses that OmniAuth concept. So that's the gist of Devise. It's really, I think we've gone over it enough in my previous videos that I think you understand it. If you don't, definitely check out a playlist I have that's honestly extending Devise or using it in such a way that's more custom. This one I use in a previous app. It's called CanCanCan. I think it's originally written by Ryan Bates, who made Rails casts. And the concept here is different user roles within a user model. So there's this concept of defining an ability class that grants a user certain abilities that they can perform. So say you have, for instance, a blog, and you want, if you come maybe from the WordPress era or place, there's like that subscriber role, there's the contributor role, there's all those different roles. This is kind of that concept, but in Ruby on Rails, but very extendable. You can just make it certain access in the initialize method here, as you can see, and just create these methods that can say if the user is an admin, they can read the post, and etc. So certain permissions can be very customizable, and then in your views, you can just as easily check those things to view certain things. And there's these handy helper can and cannots. So definitely check out the documentation. It's pretty straightforward. To lock down a controller, for instance, typically you might use something like Devise, but in this case, you would use this load and authorize resource method that allows you to go ahead and use those roles and check if that user, if they're logged in and signed up in a certain persona, I guess you could say, have access or read access or write access, etc. So you can customize that to your heart's content. I've used this maybe 1 or 2 times before. I haven't really needed a huge use for it because I haven't built so many use cases to have a user that has many specific roles in an app. It's usually like the base user or the like an admin role or something like that, which is just honestly a Boolean in the end. So it's not a big deal there. The next one, these are in no particular order by any means, but the next one I had was Chartkick, which is a sweet library that's honestly like a drop-in, and I like that it's actually up to date. So with Rails 6, you can just add the Chart.js library right away and then just render these methods in your views to just get some awesome data based on some columns you pass to it. So if you get a specific user, you can group by the specific day and create it at a count. So all these things come with this library, different types of charts as well. So that's really great in terms of like maybe an admin level. If you want to see, you start to get some feedback on your app, more people are joining or whatever you're doing, and more users are coming in, you can see real data around that at a glance, as opposed to like doing actual command line search and stuff like that with SQL or something like that. So this is a nice to have. You definitely don't need it, but it's one that is honestly a very simple installation and easy to use, and it looks good too. So with that, we have one called Annotate. I like this one a lot. Another one that's just a nice to have, but essentially when you create models in Rails, typically it generates the model file as you would if you use a generator. Say you generate a model, Rails generate model, and then some columns on that model. This will actually annotate what those are. So say you have a typical model, you put a quantity in that generator, and say it's an integer, it'll actually tell you what's going on with that and do so in the model itself, instead of you having to go search your schema.rb file and or tinker in the database just to find these things. So I find this really helpful when you're doing your migrations. You'll see this stuff update automatically, and it'll just be a set of Ruby comments that you see in the model files. And I find it really nice because I can stay within that file and not have to go hunt and search to make sure I called something a certain name or just forgot to actually add it or something like that. So really cool to have. I typically put it in the development environment. You certainly don't want this in your production environment. Wouldn't really make sense. So that one's a quick one. After that, FriendlyID I've used before. It's a great way to make your URLs in a given app pretty. And the way I tend to use it is like say a blog post or a post of whatever the record would be in the given app. I would use that as the slug, and you can find whatever existing column in the database and use that as the slug. It kind of mirrors it and uses that as the URL itself. And it really helps for things like SEO and just honestly sending a link to someone. They can really obviously remember like what it would be as opposed to a number, which is the default in Rails. It's usually like an ID number, which isn't so intuitive and kind of annoying, in other words. So it works pretty nice. You get this actual new scope that's called friendly that you need to append to your controllers that allows it to scope and find by whatever you declare in your model. So the ID is using the name attribute that you've already added to your user model and uses that for the slug. So you need to append a slug, column to your database. And then this will map that name field to it and just create like an actual slug that presents itself in the URL as you would expect. So it all happens behind the scenes, but it's a super handy feature that I add to pretty much every app I use because I care about SEO and the URLs just being really easy to read, especially with stuff where you find people sharing links from your site or to your site, etc. You really want that. Next is another one that I use for SEO, like every app, is called MetaTags. It's really helpful for adding the bulk of the stuff that you don't feel like writing to your app. It helps with making this more dynamic, but you set meta tags, so your title, attributes, your description, keywords, etc. on a given web page are really necessary for SEO and Google and search bots to crawl your site and understand what the site has, what kind of content it should display and refer to when people search for things. So I would say this is a game changer for getting the organic traffic to your web app. Whether you're trying to do that or not, it should be probably a focus once you get going. This is something I add towards the end of building a given app. It's not anything that you need to focus on immediately, but it should be in the back of your mind, I think, just because once you launch, you want to have this stuff in place so people can find it easier and just share it easily. So if you threw a link into Slack and you have, say, a Twitter card image or an open graph tags, etc., you could have that stuff predefined and it would show up in that preview that you see and just be all ready to go. So it's really nice for those things, and it's less headache later to worry about. So definitely recommend adding that one. It's very straightforward. I think there's just a handy display meta tags helper in the view you can add, and then tons of options here you can append to that to customize how that looks and whatnot. So I remember my tags ended up being like about 30 or 40 lines long. It's not uncommon for it to be that big, because you focus on things like Facebook or Twitter where people might share things. You want to give them that rich experience when they do. So this helps dramatically with that. I recommend it. Impressionist, I don't use this a ton, but I've used it to do some actual impressions on views on a given page. So if you create an app and want to just get actual impressions on either clicks or views or unique views, you can do so with this gem. It's pretty handy. It is something you want to cache, because the organic views of that can kind of get skewed in a bit. If you just constantly click through, you just gradually, that number would tick up. I've ran into issues with that before, but there are ways around it. In the guide here, it has a counter cache that you can declare that allows for that. It's pretty straightforward otherwise. I remember I used this on a Let's Build with Dribble clone kind of thing, where we got annotations on the likes and the views of the shot in the view. And this is kind of that use case, I would say. So something like that. But yeah, it's called Impressionist. It's pretty straightforward. The next is one I'm gonna use currently. I haven't used it a ton yet, but it's something I've been looking for, like a Ruby on Rails drafts concept. There's a gem called PaperTrail that does something like that, that's wrapped around the idea of versioning your records. I want something more along the lines of a blog post where it's versioning, but it's in the nomenclature of post or like published, draft or private, etc. You can add all these different scopes to it to do different things. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And this one, I could add that myself, and it's pretty straightforward. It's just kind of adding like a Boolean attribute or some sort of status attribute on a given post, and then not displaying it or displaying it relative to that. But this actually does some versioning too, which is really cool. So you might check this out. It's newer to me, so I don't know a ton about it, but I'm digging in, and it looks like it's pretty extendable. So I'm excited to try it out. But there's all these built-in methods that I would rather not create myself and have just ready to go, which is why I think I'm going to use it. So you could see how you could actually scope maybe what you're going to display based on these different live settings or trashed or published, and it just automatically handles that query and displays, say, in your views, whatever you want relative to whatever things are live or drafted or published, etc. So that's pretty cool gem. Pry and Pry-rails. Pry is another way to debug in a Ruby environment. Bybug is one that comes by default in most Rails apps. It's in your development group in your gem file. And it's great to just throw that into the mix, like say in a controller when you're running an action, say committing some sort of form. And it'll actually just halt the process so you can go into your console and debug what's going on. Say you're trying to pass parameters through or something and you don't get the ones you need, but you need to figure out why. This is great for that. Bybug does that great, but Pry goes like one step further and gives you a few built-in methods to run to show certain things about your app, or gives you some nice color preview in your console of like the SQL going on when those things render. It's really neat. So Pry is actually the main thing doing the work there. The other gem here is Pry-rails, which just makes it easier to add to a Rails app. Otherwise, you'd have to add some initializer code manually. And Pry-rails is just a bundle install gem kind of thing that does it for you. So I linked to those. There's nothing really to see behind the link other than the main pages there. But yeah. Pay is a new one by my buddies Chris and Jason. I think Jason originated this thing, but it's a new gem for payment processing in the scope, mainly for subscription payments, but it does work for basic charges too. And the idea is it uses Braintree and Stripe as the payment engines. And then inside it comes with all these helper configuration methods and stuff that you just include as like a actual Ruby class that's billable. And then you can have some actual configuration, just basically the stuff that you'd see on invoicing and stuff like that. And then within, you can create your own email templates and receipts and stuff too, which is cool. But the general idea is to just dumb down the concept of adding Stripe or Braintree to a given app and just making it trivial. So you get all these certain processing or certain methods on a user and can create charges with just these. It's like honestly just a few keystrokes, which is really cool. I haven't used it a ton. I know it's a newer gem. It's probably not listed in most places. You might find other gems, but I think it's going to get some praise pretty soon because they're actively working on it, and it seems really, really extendable and usable. And yeah, I'm excited to try it out coming up. So hats off to those guys for this. Let's see. Remind me later. Mailcatcher. So nothing really amazing about this gem. It's one that you just install globally and go with it. It runs on this local host at port 1080, and it just works well when you need to send emails locally and test them out. I found it to be the one that I've used the most. The last release was in 2016. It's old, but my God, it works great. And as they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So there are other ones out there. I think one's called Letter Opener and one's called Mail Hog or something like that. Or this one's based off of that one. I can't remember. But honestly, it's just been quick and easy to install on a Rails app. You just go into your development environment locally, add these couple of lines, and just boot up this. Make sure you install this gem, boot it up here, and then if you're sending emails, this will catch them, and you can read them and test them out there. So really recommend it in terms of just sending the emails. Rails has its own email preview, which is great, but it doesn't do the whole sending, and you can't check with like a background processing kind of gem like Sidekick or something with this. So definitely recommend this. This is one I've used it since the beginning, and I probably won't change that unless something breaks. Given that it's from 2016, things might change coming up, so we'll know soon enough. So yeah, that's one of my favorite ones there. RedCarpet, I had this mostly as an admin tool to most of my apps. I like to write in Markdown on the back end, so if I add Markdown in areas where I need to author content or blog posts or whatever, it's almost 10 times out of 10, it's going to be a Markdown driven form. And RedCarpet makes that pretty seamless and easy. So it just renders this as HTML on the front end via Ruby, of course. So you get all these built-in methods and options you can add that just allows you to customize what you do render and what you don't. You can even render the table format from like GitHub and stuff too, which is nice. But yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Yeah, Markdown, love it. Let's see, ActsAsVotable. I've used this on other apps for various things. It's, as you can imagine, either like an upvote or downvote onto particular things, but you can also use it as like a favoriting tool. I found, so you can query by like, say they upvoted the thing and you only have upvotes on your site. then you can go query from that and just like display a list of their favorite things at that point. So it's the same as like liking it in a case. So like as an example, I had originally a tutorial site where people could favorite their favorite tutorials, and then in their account they could see the feed of what they favorited instead of having to go and find it on the site or search for it, etc. Just seemed like a cool and easy thing to add. That's just honestly a few lines, a bundle install, and you're ready to go. So recommend that one too. The same is true for Taggable. Recently I've been rebuilding webcrunch.com 2.0. That's currently it's WordPress, but I'm going to push it towards being a Ruby on Rails driven app. Yeah, so I have my other app. It's going to be Ruby on Rails, and my idea is to go ahead and try it. And this gem is focused on tagging, and the idea is to make it very extendable and drop-in ready. On my current app that I'm working on, that's the WebCrunch 2.0 version, is I actually rolled it myself, which is more of a less extendable idea as this, but more my own way of doing it. So it's one thing that I said that if I can do it myself, like I said in the beginning, then I'm going to try to. But otherwise, reaching for a gem like this is not a bad choice, because it has so much potential to, you know, just make your app that much better if you need tagging of any sort. So it's really great and extendable. So it's not much more to say other than just check out the docs. It's straightforward, as I can see here. You can actually get a query of most and least used, which is nice. Pretty cool stuff. Unread. This one is pretty neat if you use kind of a messaging system built into Rails. I would say most probably reaching for something like this today are going to go something JavaScript driven that's real time. So maybe like chat instead of actual like sending an email message. But this way you can like get notified if someone views something, if it's read, like a message or a document or a comment. And once they do, maybe you send an email and let them know or something like that, just dependent on your use case. So it's really neat. And I find it quite easy to integrate. You just add a few lines to your models and a method if you want for the scope, if it's only admin or whatever, and then go from there. So once you create a new message, you can mark it as read, and it just kind of does its thing. And then from there, if you want to notify people, you can actually make a mailer that does that specific queuing and you know, goes down the list and notifies those people. So I'd find that pretty useful if I had some sort of concept of messaging or viewing of something that needs to be a notification that isn't just real time. I think this would be a good fit for that. So I haven't used it a ton. I've just recently used it, and I'm really liking it so far. So I'm throwing it in the you know, recent gems I've used. Maybe not my favorite, but just one I'm liking so far. Without a doubt, Homebrew and Homebrew-cask are my favorite gem, I would say. It's something in any new computer I get, it's the first thing I install, so I can go and install any packages I need, whether it's Ruby or RBMV or Rails or anything like that. And then Homebrew-cask makes it easy for a Mac user to install the typical apps you would normally go download that DMG file. And this does it all, which is the command. So you do like, what is it? Homebrew install or brew install your app. What is it? Brew-cask install your app. I think that's what it is. And it's so streamlined and fast and easy. You don't need to open a file, mount it, eject it after you're done installing it, copy the file over to your applications folder. It's just, that whole process seems backwards to me. So this makes that streamlined. It's more of a developer tool. So someone, the people who aren't developers probably would be like, no way I'm using that. So I get it. But yeah, those two without a doubt are my initial first and continuously used gems of all time. So I think this is called Pagy. I'm going to say Pagy. Recently switched from Will Paginate. It used to be my de facto pagination gem. I don't need to paginate a lot, but Pagy is way more faster, as you can see. And that's what kind of sparked my interest in it, really, is just performance. So pagination could get kind of resource heavy, I guess you could say, and this one makes it a little nicer and easier to use in terms of paginating anything in your Rails app. So I recommend it, and it's quite easy to integrate. It looks a little funky here to throw this in your controller, but that's how it actually looks. And then you just render it here. You can actually customize the partial too that comes with it, which I've recently done for the blog I'm working on. So it's pretty cool. Sidekick, of course, is a background processing gem. It's used by tons of folks, and I think one guy runs it, which is awesome. There's a pro version. It's basically what I use for any type of background processing, mostly for me, emails. You don't want to send those all at once. Your server would just bust, basically. If you send a ton of emails, especially, you need to give it the concept of queuing that stuff up, and that's what Sidekick does. It allows you to scale your app pretty fast and get things just thrown in a queue that operate in a constant loop, I guess you could say. It's really useful, and yeah, I'd really recommend it. There's the default active job in Ruby on Rails, but there's the way you install Sidekick is as an adapter to that, and it kind of hooks into the integration and rolls with it from there. And I just like it more. It's got a GUI interface that you can see real things happening, or if there's stuff that you need to like retry jobs that failed, you can do so from the interface, and it's really useful. I typically mark that as authenticated only by admins in my apps, so you can log in as you, as long as you're an admin, and see that interface. So really recommend it. Finally, and this list isn't exhaustive. It's not every gem that I would use. I've used many more, but whenever gem is a great way to do cron job stuff. So maybe you need to run emails at a specific hour every specific month or week or whatever, send out newsletter, I don't know. Whenever is a great tool for that. It's very simple to set up, and Ruby logic behind it is obviously simple, as you might expect. So it reads like English every day at 4:30 a.m. and 6 p.m. Run this model, and then perform some task, whatever it may be. It's usually a rake task that you add to your rake folder. I haven't done anything like that on the channel, but maybe I'll get into something like that where you can run this task, and it's automated, and it's very useful, and you can sleep at night knowing it will go. Assuming you don't get errors or anything happens to the server and whatnot. So typically you would combine whenever with a rake task with something like Sidekick to do all your processing, streamline it, and run that however often you want, basically. And this allows all that to kind of queue up and do its thing. So it's really great. Yeah, so that is the non-exhaustive list, I should say. There's so many more gems out there you should check out, but these are the ones I've definitely used in my time. Few are very new to me, but I'm going to use them more, and I'm excited to get going with those. If you have any gems that you like and want to shout out, definitely throw them in the comments. I'd be interested to see your favorites as well. So I think that's it, guys. If you have any questions for me or want me to cover something in particular with regards to maybe these gems or something in the future, definitely let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. Peace.